Hello once again, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this Wednesday's edition of Alaska Weather. And the first graphic tonight, hazardous weather graphic once again. And in the greater Fairbanks area, or the greater Fairbanks area, there's a dense fog advisory currently out until 7 p.m. this evening for dense fog. Visibility is reduced to a quarter mile in areas up there. And then down over the northern southeast coast, winter storm warning for heavy snow and is currently out. And then the southern panhandle, a high wind warning out. Taking a look at those a little more in detail. The winter storm warning for the northern inner channels, specifically along the Haines and Klondike highways, and snow accumulations of 4 to 8 inches on the Klondike and Haines highway are expected or likely, and that's out until 6 a.m. Thursday or throughout the night tonight. You can see on the map on the right, Haines expecting itself a little less than an inch. Skagway, same thing, but the heavier amounts are on the outer edges there, up toward White Pass, showing 6 to 8 inches. And over toward Haines Customs, 6 to 8 inches there as well. Everywhere else, really not picking up too much at all. And then down to the south for the high wind warning, and that's out from through tonight, or until midnight tonight for this evening, until midnight tonight. And that's for winds gusting to 60 miles an hour with storm force winds on the outer coastal waters continuing through this evening until midnight, and then they should come down under that. Those levels below warning and storm force wind levels after midnight. And then things should improve a little bit but before picking up again with the next system. And moving on to satellite imagery, you can see quite vividly there that storm moving northward there off the southeast coast, and one band pushing in, main front now along the coast, actually pushing inland a little bit there into western Canada. Another one developing back to the southwest there with very cold air coming down, as you can see the open cell cumulus there, well south and southeast of Kodiak Island. That kind of developing another frontal boundary just to the northeast there, a thinner band of clouds. Otherwise, moisture backing westward brought snow into Kodiak today, and last report they were about 1 mile in snow with winds out of the northwest gusting to 35 miles an hour, temperature right around the freezing point there. And then out to the west, next system pushing across the Bering Sea brought warmer conditions with it, with rain into the Pribilof, some light rain into the eastern Aleutians as well, and the main precipitation still to the north and west of the reporting stations, coming back down across the western Aleutians. And otherwise mostly dry over the interior, mostly cloudy south central Alaska today. Gusty north winds though, Resurrection Bay 35 miles an hour to the north for Seward, then the snow backing into Kodiak Island there. And rainfall amounts, actually wind speed gusts, peak wind gusts at Heidelberg late this morning, 81 miles per hour. Ketchikan, Cape Decision had peak winds of around 60 miles an hour. And up to the north, Juneau was up close to 40 miles per hour. And rainfall amounts anywhere from 1 inch to 1.5 inches over the southern panhandle. And more specifically, Petersburg picking up 1.5 inches. And that's a 12-hour amount ending at mid-afternoon today. Juneau, by contrast to the north, just 0.18 of an inch. And the Alaska Peninsula seeing northwest winds gusting 35 to 50 miles per hour. Still a pretty tight gradient there, but that's going to diminish considerably and turn more west-southwest tonight with light snow showers continuing, and rain and snow, or just plain rain for the Pribilofs, and warmer temperatures should slide into the eastern Aleutians as well, but any precipitation is going to be pretty light. That front washes out as it moves inland. Another one developing there off the southeast coast, so the wind and rain will slowly diminish throughout the night tonight, but won't end completely. And then for Thursday, that next front developing, and the low finally taking a track to the east and south, or actually due east, should cross Prince of Wales Island, the low center, overnight Thursday night into Friday. And the front out to the west there, pushing snow into the western interior areas, into the Kuskokwim Valley, with some light snow reaching the western Alaska Range. But a new low center there just north of the Alaska Peninsula will move quite rapidly to the east, and should be, the front will be bearing down on the panhandle in the afternoon under good westerly flow aloft, following the jet carrying it along. Wind and rain on the increase again along the coast later in the day after a brief break, and snow showers possible eastern Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island, chance of light snow southeast interior, and snow likely over the western part of the state. And for the lows tonight, upper 30s to lower 40s for the Panhandle, otherwise mid-30s North Gulf Coast, 20s and 30s elsewhere, followed by highs in the 40s for the southeast coast, 30s south central Alaska, but west and east of the Alaska, or actually west of the Kuskokwim Valley, highs in the 20s, same thing for the Copper River Basin. Lows a little cooler, but all above zero for the morning Wednesday, and the Panhandle well above zero in the upper 30s to lower 40s, but Kodiak down to 29. Highs Wednesday afternoon, upper 30s Kodiak, southern Kenai Peninsula, lower to mid 30s south central Alaska, Susitna Manuska Valleys, 15 to 20 Kuskokwim Valley, 40s to near 50 for the Panhandle. Up to the north, lows tonight, mostly single numbers and teens all the way out to the Arctic coast, closer to 20 out to the west. And highs tomorrow, 10 to 15 or so, are in the teens, eastern part of the state, and lower 20s to mid 20s, say around Nome. And then the lows the following morning, mostly single numbers, except teens out toward the Bering Strait, followed by highs, single numbers and teens, lower 20s out toward the Bering Strait, and 20s for the Pribilof, southwest coast tonight, lower 30s for the Aleutians, highs tomorrow, lower 40s for the Aleutians, 30s for the Alaska Peninsula, near 31 for St. Paul, mid-20s southwest coast, followed by lows 15 to 20 for the southwest coast, mid-teens St. Lawrence Island, mid-20s for the Pribilofs, and high upper 30s for the Aleutians, followed by highs in the mid-40s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather, a band of IFR with that front coming across the Bering Sea onto the southwest coast and pushing inland, extending back to the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, and then on down to the central Aleutians. IFR also for the central Arctic coast and over the eastern Alaska range and northward there to roughly south of Chicken, including Northway and Tok areas, Mid-Tanana Valley, marginal VFR south of the Alaska range, some IFR and Cook Inlet, and also for the eastern North Gulf Coast, marginal for the remainder of the Panhandle, Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, VFR, as well as the Koyukuk Valley and eastern Brooks Range for the afternoon. IFR pushing eastward across the Kuskokwim Valley into the western Alaska Range, down to Iliamna Lake, back to the northwest across the Seward Peninsula, Kobuk, Selawik, Noatak Valleys, and much of the northwest coast. Marginal VFR for the Arctic coast, but some VFR for the central eastern Brooks Range down into the Koyukuk Valley and the northern Yukon Flats, Porcupine River area, and some marginal VFR over the southwest interior, becoming VFR for Nunivak Island, marginal for the Pribilofs, IFR eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, but VFR for the central western Aleutians, southern Panhandle becoming VFR, otherwise marginal VFR for the northern three-quarters of the southeast coast and the eastern North Gulf Coast, marginal VFR, northern Prince William Sound, Valdez, on up through to about across the Copper River Basin, mostly IFR. IFR in those areas from Copper River Basin, now northern Cook Inlet for Friday morning. Northern Prince William Sound, back to the northwest across the central interior Yukon River, right up to the western Brooks Range and the northwest coast, as well as the Noatak Valley. IFR for the area for the central Arctic coast down to about Wainwright or so. Aleutian, southern Bering Sea, VFR, marginal VFR, Pribilofs along the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island. Another round of IFR there, east side of Kodiak Island, in across the Gulf of Alaska. Marginal VFR for the central and southern Panhandle. VFR for Lincoln Glacier Bay, Yakutat right on the edge. And for Friday afternoon, another band of IFR pushes into the interior again, Bristol Bay up in toward western Iliamna Lake, and then back to the Seward Peninsula. Some more IFR over the eastern North Gulf Coast, eastern Prince William Sound into the Copper River Basin. Pretty good for the North Slope. Some marginal VFR grazing the central and eastern Arctic coast. And mostly marginal VFR for the Panhandle with some VFR down to the south. Anatuvik, marginal VFR at times, as well as Adigan, be mostly VFR throughout the day on Thursday. Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal VFR possible on the western approaches of both passes, otherwise VFR. And marginal VFR also for the approach to the western entrance of Rainy Pass, otherwise VFR. Windy, north side could see some marginal VFR, otherwise pretty good conditions there. And for Isabel, marginal VFR. Mentasta, mostly marginal through the day Thursday. Antonita, VFR. Portage, VFR. And Chilcoot and White, IFR. Moving on to the freezing levels. At the surface, right across northern Cook Inlet, down into northern Bristol Bay, northeast Bristol Bay there, near King Salmon, and then just inland along the southwest interior to just north of St. Lawrence Island, 2,000 to 4,000 feet over the central eastern Aleutians, as well as the Panhandle, and 2,000 feet back toward Kodiak Island. Icing, areas of isolated, moderate, mostly rime, possibly mixed icing, North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle, and a narrowing band pushing eastward there with that front in toward Iliamna Lake, across the Kuskokwim Valley, back to the northwest of the Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue, and possible icing at times of the isolated, moderate variety, mostly light, eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Jet stream, westerlies, 130 knots across the southern Bering Sea and the eastern Aleutians. Strongest jet now south of the Panhandle. 60 knotters, though, at 9,000 feet across the central southeast coast, otherwise west 50 for the Alaska Peninsula, and at 3,000 feet. Westerly winds 40 knots over the northwest Bering Sea and west 50 knots there across the Alaska Peninsula, south 55 knots off the southeast coast. Turbulence, considerable moderate turbulence there, Prince of Wales Island, with light to isolated moderate for Kodiak Island, the Aleutian Range, Alaska Peninsula, and the central Aleutians. After the break, I'll return with the marine forecasts.
When I first started working here in the early 90s, this is where the glacier was. I mean, where we're walking right now would have been a pile of gravel that had been pushed up by the glacier, and then we would have had 100 to 200 foot high cliffs of ice right here. And as you can see, that's changed quite a bit. And if you look at that in 2 dimensions, you can sort of see the terminus used to be here, now it's back there. That gives you one measure. What that kind of 2-dimensional look doesn't show is how much mass has been lost, that the glacier has just sort of deflated. These 200-foot cliffs of ice have disappeared and pulled back to this gentle sloping glacier you see now.
When I was working in Kenai Fjords National Park, I used the topographic maps to navigate where I was, and I realized that the mapping of the glaciers was really off. The glaciers had receded a lot. There were new rivers and lakes that were establishing where the ice used to be or should have been according to the maps. And so then I did a study on this and found out that we had a 5% loss of glacier ice mass in the Kenai Fjords area between 1950 and 1985. A big change.
You know, one of the most compelling things we do, though, to document glacier change is simply take photographs. We've had repeat photography projects here at the park. They may not give you the most accurate data in terms of how much mass or real specific measurements, but what they do give you is a visual representation that can't be argued with. I mean, it really requires no interpretation.
Understanding what's happening, understanding these processes, and possibly being able to predict what's going to happen in the future is the best that we can do, and that requires science and research.
There's considerable research on climate change in Alaska. The most significant, I would say right now, is the Natural Resources Inventory and Monitoring Program, which is looking at change across a wide variety of vital signs or indicators.
Kenai Fjords National Park is actually a pretty good representation of what's going on globally with regards to glacier ice retreat. There have been studies showing that mountain glaciers are retreating all over the planet. There are probably well over 90% of the glaciers are in retreat status. There are a few that are advancing, and some are holding their terminus point. But the Kenai Fjords, the tidewater glaciers are retreating more dramatically, but even the land-based glaciers in the terminus positions are retreating. It's pretty common for all the mountain glaciers. The big mountain glaciers in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, they're mostly in retreat too. We're really entering an interesting phase where what we call the cryosphere, the ice on the planet, is melting.
You know, in the more immediate past, it's clear that since the Pleistocene, glaciers have been retreating. So the idea that glaciers retreat is nothing, is no revelation. They've been retreating from across North America for the last 10,000 years. What appears to have changed and what has people's attention is the rate at which they're retreating. In the case of Exit Glacier, you know, we have scientists who've been looking at it. We have evidence that the glaciers left behind, where we can track that retreat for about the last 200 years. And we can say with confidence that in the last decade, that rate has increased.
Terminus mapping is a great way to map a small portion of the ice field. We come out twice a year and we use a GPS to walk the edge of the terminus and map the farthest extent of Exit Glacier. And that allows us to see what type of changes are occurring over the winter accumulation period and the summer ablation period. With that data, that can help us as we witness these changes within the ice field, we can hopefully be able to correlate that with the weather data that we have.
You know, when you look at an ice field that's 750 square miles, when you look at a glacier that towers hundreds of feet high, you get a sense of permanence. You think these things are massive, they're somehow a permanent sort of feature, and yet in a very short period of time, in a matter of a couple of decades, we've seen dramatic change in those things.
At Exit Glacier, we have a time-lapse camera set up on the glacier that allows us to take a couple photos every single day, and then to put that sequence of photos into a video where we can see changes of the glacier and the vegetation phenology throughout an entire year.
Virtually all the glaciers in Alaska are receding. Some glaciers are moving forward. That's not an indication that they're actually growing in size. It's just the rate at which they're slipping down the mountain.
In some cases, some of these glaciers are receding back up onto land, and so they're producing less ice. When you change a glacier system, you're changing habitat for marine mammals and other wildlife. And the populations of harbor seals have dropped dramatically in the fjords. In 1980, shortly after the establishment of the park, in Island Bay, we had maybe 1,500 harbor seals. Nowadays, you know, it's a few hundred.
In Arctic environments, much of the sunlight that reaches the Earth bounces back because it hits snow and reflects off into space, or ice on the ocean and reflects off into space. That's the albedo effect. When the snow thaws and instead you have rock or vegetation, or when the ice thaws and you have transparent ocean, the sunlight will convert to other wavelengths. It'll convert essentially to warmth. That does not bounce back into the atmosphere as much. So consequently, you get a warming of the ocean, you get a warming of the ground, you get a thawing of frozen soils or permafrost, you get a more rapid thawing of sea ice. So once the ice and once the snow is off of the surface, the rate of warming increases considerably.
If you're driving out to Exit Glacier, you'll actually start to see signs along the side of the road that have dates on them. Visitors sometimes are confused. They think they're elevations or something until they get up to the glacier and realize, oh, those were all date signs along the road that were telling me when the glacier was there. Another thing that's been happening in the Exit Glacier area in recent years is this flooding that comes at a time we're not used to. We're used to having maybe some flooding in the fall when we have a lot of heavy rain. This has suddenly been some flooding that's coming in the middle of the summer, usually not associated with precipitation events. It's associated with warmer weather and melting. When you walk down one of our trails that leads to Exit Glacier, there are a number of ways to get out there, but what used to be the main route is no longer really the main route because of the way the glacier has changed. So this main route to the glacier used to provide dramatic views of the glacier as you walk towards it. In fact, there was a large kiosk built at the end of this trail for people to stop and rest and enjoy the view of the glacier. Now, if they stop and rest at this kiosk, people think, why did the park put a kiosk here? Because it looks out at some shrubs. And there's no glacier within view anymore.
The way we solve big problems like this is not all at once. There's a thing called the Sokolov's wedges, and you just take a little bite of the pie, one sliver at a time. So we try to do incremental changes.
When we talk to people about our concerns about climate change, about the changes that are happening to the glacier, we also want to leave them with some idea of what we're doing to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. For example, here at the park, as we retire vehicles out of our fleet, we try to replace them with electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We've done things like at the Glacier Nature Center, helping to sort of experiment and install a cutting-edge fuel cell, as opposed to running some traditional power source out there that relies on some sort of more greenhouse producing gas.
My main hope for the future is that people get the message that the planet is changing fairly rapidly in places, particularly places like Kenai Fjords National Park, and that it is, we think, there's good evidence it's a result of atmospheric changes which are measured in terms of human inputs into the atmosphere.
The rapid rate at which these glaciers are changing now offers us the opportunity to talk about this place as a way of looking into the future. In a lot of parts of the country, climate change issues are a little more subtle, and we can point here and say, look how fast this is changing. This is what the future holds for perhaps a lot of us and a lot of the planet as climate continues to change.
I'm optimistic that people and nature will adapt to change, but my expectation is that change will occur. Time will tell.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the coastal water forecast along the south coast of the Panhandle. Thursday, gale warning, south winds 35 knots and those seas 25 to 32 feet. And east to south winds for the north coast at 30 knots and those seas over 30 feet, 30 to 35 feet. Lynn Canal, gale warning, south winds 35 knots, 6-foot seas, south 25 for Stevens Passage with gusts of 40 knots. Clarence Strait, southeast 20 knots, seas 10 feet. And then for the day on Friday, northwest winds 30 knots for Clarence Strait with seas at about 6 feet. And for the south coast, west-southwest winds 30 knots, seas coming down to under 20 feet. And the north coast, southeast to southwest winds 30 to 35 knots. Northern Interchannel, north winds 20 knots, Stevens Passage, southeast winds 25 knots. Prince William Sound, Thursday, north winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. Northeast winds 30 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, north 25 for the western coast, and northwest 40 knots for the Barren Islands. Kamishak Bay, pretty windy day for Thursday. Winds will be out of the west at 40 knots. Cook Inlet, north to northwest winds 10 to 15 knots. For Friday, small craft advisories, Prince William Sound, northeast winds coming up to 30 knots, seas building to 6 feet. Gale warnings for the eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 35 knots. Gale warnings also for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay. For northwest winds, 45 knots, seas 13 to 16 feet. Small craft advisories for southern Cook Inlet for north winds at 25 knots and 7-foot seas. North of the Foreland Zone, winds will be out of the north at 15 knots. Kodiak Island, gale warnings for Thursday, west-northwest winds 30 to 40 knots. Alaska Peninsula, small craft advisories, west-southwest winds 30 knots. Bristol Bay, southwest winds 25 knots, seas 6 feet. And for Friday, Alaska Peninsula, west-northwest winds 30 knots. Northwest winds 30 knots for Bristol Bay. And storm warnings for Kodiak Island, west winds 50 knots, but Chillicothe Strait, northwest at 35. And for the eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 30 knots, seas 14 to 16 feet. Central Aleutians about the same. Southwest winds 30 knots, and north to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots for the western Aleutians. And on Friday, gale warnings for the western Aleutian areas, east winds 35 knots, central Aleutians, east winds at 30 knots. Unamac Island, looking at northeast winds at 25 knots. Unalaska Island, northwest at 20 to 25 knots. For the southwest coast, West winds for the day Thursday, 20 to 25 knots, strongest south of Nunivak Island with seas up around 8 to 9 feet. For St. Matthew, St. Paul, and St. George Islands, west winds 20 knots. For St. Matthew Island, or for St. Lawrence Island, southwest winds at 20 knots and southeast at 20 for Norton Sound. For Friday, Norton Sound southwesterlies only at 15 knots and a lighter west wind at 20 knots for St. Lawrence Island. Small craft advisories for the southwest coast, west winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island, west winds 30 knots with 13 to 16 foot seas. Central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast on Thursday, brisk wind advisories, east winds 25 knots. Small craft advisories for the western Arctic coast, east winds at 30 knots. Chuck CC, east winds 15 knots. And for Friday, Wales to Cape Thompson, north winds 20 knots. Western Arctic coast, northeast winds 25 knots. You can see those seas 9 to 11 feet. And for the central Arctic coast northeast at 25 knots. Otherwise, the eastern Beaufort Sea coast winds are lightening up, but still out of the east at 15 to 20 knots. And for tonight, low pressure remains in the Gulf of Alaska, actually pulling back to the west or northwest a little bit, and then taking a turn to the southeast, all happening tonight. So rain and wind will begin to diminish, but won't end completely. Look for some snow showers for Kodiak Island after the snow early this evening, late this afternoon. Same thing for south central Alaska. Next front pushes some snow onto the southwest coast, and for tomorrow, that low starts tracking in toward Prince of Wales Island late in the day and will track right across the southern panhandle Thursday night with that front again right along the south coast tomorrow afternoon. 1,002 millibar low near Bristol Bay tracks eastward into the Gulf with a front approaching the southeast coast by afternoon, moving at a pretty good clip there with good upper level jet stream pushing it along. Snow over the western interior, mostly dry with some snow flurries over the southeast interior, and again rain on the increase with winds increasing on the north coast mostly, and the Bering Sea not looking too bad with high pressure, some lingering rain and snow showers to the eastern Aleutians, otherwise light winds.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.